We're in a moment where American power is receding. Crisis of American power, in large measure because American power was so pervasive and extraordinary for 2 decades, and that situation could not continue. I guess many of us assumed that would be the world as it would exist forever, but it wasn't. America was responsible for half of the world's GDP after World War II, and now it's responsible for 22 or 23%. And we see these dynamics of recession of American power in many parts of the world, but in Europe as well. And once American power is receding, it creates something of a vacuum, which Putin is exploring and is trying to fill. The situation in Europe, I think, might have been predicted at a very high level of generality and abstraction. I'm not convinced that you need to have a full understanding of Putin's psychology or a full understanding of Russian history. To me, as an analyst, it almost seems that knowing that American power is receding, knowing that Putin had 20 years to consolidate and reinforce Russian power after a deep crisis, knowing that European power is still to be born, particularly on the military and defense dimensions. It is obvious to see that sooner or later you would have a vacuum developing in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, and that would lead in some form or another to conflict. That's the clinical, analytical part of the issue. Then there's a more shocking part to our moral conscience. Putin has decided, in this case, influenced by history and even by authors that he's read, he's decided that Ukraine is really largest and most continuous threat to the Russian world. And this is not something of the last 10 years. It is true that Ukraine in the last 10 years started to Europeanize very fast. Kiev started to look like a vibrant European city, and all this was a threat. But it's not just the last 10 years. One could even speculate that throughout the centuries, Ukraine was always that part of Eastern Europe and of the Russian Empire later that felt closer to Europe. Starting even from the Middle Ages, where Kiev was in many respects a cultural reflection of Byzantium and therefore still of the Roman Empire. It is a different world throughout the century. And many authors, including authors that Putin likes a lot, always saw Ukraine as a kind of a threat, a ghost, the image of what a westernized Russia could become. So in all those debates about how Russia had to resist westernization, Ukraine featured prominently as a threat. And Putin has embraced all that. And it's, of course, terrible because the consequences are essentially what I believe could be called a war of genocide because, and I'm surprised people don't talk about this, because in all his statements, going back to the essay last summer, he has said very clearly that the Ukrainian people does not exist. And therefore, it has to be destroyed, that fundamentally it doesn't exist. And what we have now is some kind of aberration. And we have to correct the aberration by destroying not only the Ukrainian state, but Ukrainian nationhood. And once you announce that you're going to use military means to destroy a people, not to destroy physically every individual, but to destroy its existence as a people. And therefore, practically, you either assimilate to Russia or you are physically destroyed. This, I think, deserves the name of genocide. And therefore, we have the unfortunate circumstance that a geopolitical crisis has also developed within a brutal war of genocide. There are geopolitical reasons why this is happening, but Putin, instead of giving it a geopolitical color, he has given it a cultural, national, and eliminationist color. This is NATO as the linchpin of the existing order that he wants to destroy. But even if you wanted to, let us say, leave NATO entirely alone, these crises have dynamics that you can't completely control. So I think there will be threats to NATO itself. But I obviously also don't think that he will now overrun the whole of Eastern and Central Europe simply because Russia is today still a diminished power with limited resources to do that. He will not be able to permanently occupy Ukraine, let alone do something more ambitious. But you have to point out that you will certainly be wanting to create trouble within NATO, because that's also where his leverage comes from. He will be very inclined to create trouble in the Balkans, particularly in Bosnia. As the dynamic becomes one of open conflict between Europe and Russia, we have to be prepared for all kinds of attempts to destabilize Europe from within. not that the Russian army will invade Poland, but that there will be many attempts to destabilize Europe from within, where some weak spots can be detected. And then you have the dynamics proper to a conflict of this kind. So just to give an example, we're not too abstract. Imagine within a few months, perhaps Ukraine will be partitioned to an eastern Russian-controlled eastern Ukraine and a Western-controlled independent Ukraine, a little bit in the image of those partitions during the Cold War in Germany and Korea. That's a very plausible scenario. And then you have some kind of insurgency developing in Western Ukraine, or even if there's no formal partition, if the insurgency is concentrated in Western Ukraine, we know very well, I think you know that even better than me, many European countries, particularly Poland, will be trying to help Ukraine, not just because they feel close to Ukraine, but because Poland feels that Russia has to be resisted now and not later. And therefore, there's enormous potential here for conflict of different kinds. If weapons are being supplied through the Polish border to Ukraine, to what extent would Russia, Kremlin, Putin be able to tolerate this? Would there be some limited attacks on Poland to try to make it stop? The potential for catastrophic consequences is now almost unlimited of this kind. So if people have the kind of naive view that this only concerns Ukraine, no, I disagree with that. But if people think within 2 years the Russian army will be in Berlin, I also don't think that's the case. It's going to be something in the middle.